The winter of 1941 descended upon Leningrad like a closing fist. As September gave way to October, the temperatures plummeted, and with them, any remaining hope that the Red Army might break through the German encirclement. The city that bore Lenin's name, the birthplace of the Bolshevik Revolution, now found itself completely cut off from the rest of the Soviet Union. What followed would become one of the longest and most devastating sieges in human history. 872 days, during which a modern European metropolis was slowly starved, frozen, and bombarded into submission, yet somehow refused to surrender. When German Army Group North reached the outskirts of Leningrad in early September 1941, Hitler made a calculated decision. Rather than commit his forces to costly street-by-street urban warfare, he would simply surround the city and wait. The logic was brutally simple. Why sacrifice German soldiers when hunger and cold would do the work for them? On September 8th, the ring closed. The last road connection was severed when German forces captured the town of Schlisselburg on Lake Ladoga, and the siege officially began. Nearly 3 million people, both civilians and soldiers, were now trapped inside a city that had never been designed to be self-sufficient. The timing could not have been worse. Leningrad had always relied on food shipped in from other regions of the Soviet Union. The city's warehouses held perhaps a month's worth of supplies, maybe 2 if rationing was implemented immediately. But nobody in the Soviet leadership wanted to admit that Leningrad might be cut off for an extended period. That would be defeatist thinking, and defeatism could get you shot. So the rationing, when it finally came, was too little, too late. By the time authorities fully grasped the magnitude of the catastrophe unfolding, precious food stores had been consumed, and winter was already arriving. The first sign that this would be unlike any siege in modern history came in late September, when the Germans bombed the Badaev warehouses, Leningrad's main food storage facility. The raid set ablaze 2,500 tons of flour and 2,500 tons of sugar. Witnesses reported that the sugar melted and seeped into the earth, creating a sweet, sticky morass. In the desperate months that followed, people would dig up this contaminated soil and eat it, sugar and dirt mixed together, because it was food, or close enough to food to keep you alive for another day. As autumn progressed, the rations were cut again and again. Factory workers, the most privileged class in the Soviet food hierarchy, saw their daily bread ration reduced from 800 grams in September to 375 grams by November. White-collar workers and children received even less, just 250 grams. By late November, as the full horror of the situation became undeniable, the rations hit their lowest point. Manual workers received 250 grams of bread daily. Everyone else got 125 grams, a piece roughly the size of 2 slices of sandwich bread, and even this was stretched with sawdust, cellulose, and whatever else could be baked into something resembling bread. That was it. That was all the food the state could guarantee each day. Everything else, every additional calorie, every scrap of protein, every drop of fat, had to be found, bartered for, or stolen. In a city of 3 million souls, this decree was effectively a death sentence for hundreds of thousands. The cold arrived with merciless punctuality. November brought freezing temperatures. December was colder still. January 1942 saw temperatures drop to minus 30 degrees Celsius, sometimes lower. The city's infrastructure, already strained, began to collapse. The electrical grid failed. The water system froze solid. Heating systems shut down. Leningraders found themselves not only starving, but freezing in their own apartments, in a city that had once been a showcase of Soviet modernity. People burned furniture to stay warm. They burned books, doors, floorboards, anything combustible. They wore every piece of clothing they owned, layer upon layer, until they could barely move. Survivors recalled the peculiar silence that settled over the city. The trams had stopped running. There were no cars. Fuel was reserved exclusively for military use. The only sounds were the periodic shriek of German artillery shells and the quiet shuffle of people's feet as they pulled sleds through the snow. These sleds, often makeshift affairs cobbled together from whatever materials could be found, were everywhere. They were used to haul water from the Neva River, to transport what little firewood could be scavenged, and, increasingly, to carry the dead. The dead were everywhere. They lay in the streets, frozen solid, sometimes covered with a light dusting of snow, sometimes not. They accumulated in building lobbies, in apartments, in hospital corridors. The morgues overflowed. The cemeteries could not keep pace. The ground was frozen solid, making burial nearly impossible, and the grave diggers themselves were dying of starvation. Bodies were stacked like cordwood in public spaces, waiting for spring thaw when they might be properly buried. Some never received even that dignity. People died in strange, quiet ways. They would be walking down the street and simply stop, sitting down on a curb or leaning against a wall, and they would not get up again. They died in bread lines, waiting for their daily ration. They died in their beds, alone, with no one to discover them for days or weeks. They died at their workbenches in factories, committed to their labor until the very end. The official Soviet euphemism for these deaths was dystrophy, a clinical term that masked the brutal reality. People were starving to death in their hundreds of thousands. The psychology of starvation is a particular kind of horror. At first comes the constant gnawing hunger, the stomach pains, the fixation on food, the dreams of feasts that wake you to the cold reality of an empty room. But as the body consumes its own fat reserves, then its own muscle, the symptoms change. Weakness becomes profound. Movement requires tremendous effort. The mind begins to falter. Concentration becomes difficult. Memory fails. Judgment deteriorates. People developed hunger disease, a constellation of symptoms including massive edema, where the body swells with fluid, creating the cruel illusion of health, even as the person wastes away inside. In this environment, the social fabric began to tear. Families turned on each other as the instinct for survival overrode normal human bonds. Ration cards became more valuable than money, and their theft could mean death. There are accounts of family members stealing food from each other, of parents taking bread from their children, of children watching their parents die, and hiding the bodies to continue collecting their rations. The Leningraders did not speak of these things after the war, and official Soviet histories certainly did not acknowledge them, but they happened nonetheless. And then there was cannibalism. The subject was taboo, forbidden by Soviet authorities during and after the siege, but the NKVD records tell the story. The secret police documented thousands of cases, people arrested for cannibalism and corpse eating. The distinction mattered under Soviet law. Corpse eating, consuming the flesh of those already dead, carried a lesser sentence than the murder of a person for consumption. The NKVD established special patrols to catch cannibals. They investigated disappearances, particularly of children, who were especially vulnerable. Bodies were sometimes found with flesh carved away. Meat of suspicious origin appeared in the markets. One woman was discovered keeping her dead husband in the apartment, cutting away pieces of him day by day to survive. These cases were handled with extreme discretion. People found guilty were usually shot or sent to the Gulag, far from Leningrad, where they might speak of what they had done. The Soviet state could not acknowledge that socialism had reduced people to eating each other. That narrative did not fit. So the cases were documented in secret police files and otherwise erased from the official story of the siege. Yet alongside these darkest expressions of human desperation, there were also extraordinary acts of preservation and defiance. The scholars at the Institute of Plant Industry, surrounded by tons of edible seeds and grain samples, chose to starve rather than consume the collection. They guarded these seeds through the winter, seeds from all over the world that represented decades of scientific work. Several scientists died at their posts, surrounded by food they refused to eat because they believed, or wanted to believe, that these seeds would matter more to the future than their individual survival. The staff at the Hermitage Museum, one of the world's great art collections, remained at their posts throughout the siege. They sheltered in the basement as German shells struck the building. They protected paintings and sculptures. When the collection was evacuated to the Urals, the staff who remained created a museum of the siege itself, documenting the horror around them, believing that this too needed to be recorded and remembered. Musicians continued to perform. The Leningrad Radio Orchestra, reduced to a handful of emaciated players, continued to broadcast. When the composer Dmitri Shostakovich completed his Seventh Symphony, written during the early months of the siege, the remaining members of the city's orchestra, many near death from starvation, were gathered to perform it. The concert was held on August 9th, 1942, and was broadcast throughout the city and to the German lines. Survivors speak of weeping as they listened, not just because of the music, but because the concert itself was an act of defiance. It said, "We are still here. We are still human. We are still creating beauty, and you cannot destroy us." The one thing that kept Leningrad alive, barely, was Lake Ladoga. In winter, when the lake froze solid, it became the road of life, a treacherous ice highway across which trucks could bring supplies into the city and evacuate people out. The first convoys crossed in November 1941, feeling their way across the ice, never certain if it would hold. German artillery targeted the route constantly. Aircraft strafed the trucks. The ice sometimes gave way without warning, sending vehicles and drivers to the bottom of the lake. But the convoys kept running because they had to. There was no other way. The supplies that came across the ice road were never enough, but they were something. The daily rations increased slightly. Not much. Workers went from 250 grams to 350 grams of bread. Others from 125 to 200 grams. But when you are starving, that difference can mean survival. Tens of thousands were evacuated across the ice, the weakest first, prioritized in theory, though not always in practice. The evacuation saved lives, but it also broke families apart. Those who left did not know if they would see their city again, or if their relatives would survive, until the reunion that might never come. Spring 1942 brought a different set of horrors. The ice on the Neva melted. The mounds of frozen corpses thawed, creating an enormous public health crisis. The survivors, weakened but alive, were mobilized in a massive cleanup effort. Bodies were collected and buried in mass graves. The streets were cleared. The city was scrubbed. Vegetable gardens were planted in every available space. Parks, boulevards, front yards, anywhere soil could be turned. These gardens would help, though they could not solve the fundamental problem that Leningrad remained surrounded and cut off. The siege continued through 1942 and into 1943. The rations improved somewhat, never abundant, but sufficient to prevent the mass death of that first terrible winter. The Germans continued to shell the city, methodically, persistently. They had maps marked with schools, hospitals, and residential areas, and they targeted them deliberately. The shelling killed thousands more, adding to the death toll, even as starvation receded slightly from its peak. People learned which streets were more exposed to artillery, which routes were safer. They learned to recognize the particular whistle of incoming shells and where to take cover, though cover was often illusory. The Soviet military launched repeated offensives to break the siege, all of which failed at enormous cost. The Red Army would mass forces, attack the German positions, gain a few kilometers perhaps, and then be thrown back. The Germans held. Their position was strong, their defensive works formidable. Through 1942 and most of 1943, the ring remained closed, and Leningrad remained isolated. The breakthrough finally came in January 1943, when Soviet forces managed to open a narrow land corridor south of Lake Ladoga. It was barely 10 kilometers wide, under constant German fire, but it allowed trains to run into the city for the first time in over a year. The supplies that came through this corridor, known as the Corridor of Death because of the incessant German shelling, were not enough to end hardship, but they made survival considerably less precarious. The full lifting of the siege did not come until January 1944, when a massive Soviet offensive finally drove Army Group North away from Leningrad's outskirts. On January 27, 1944, Soviet artillery fired a victory salute over the Neva, and for the first time in 872 days, Leningrad was no longer under siege. The people who had survived gathered in the streets, many of them weeping. The city was in ruins, damaged by shelling, pocked with shell craters, many buildings destroyed. But it was free. The death toll of the Siege of Leningrad remains uncertain. Soviet official figures claimed approximately 670,000 dead, but historians now believe the true number was far higher, possibly as many as 1.5 million people. Most died not from German bombs or bullets, but from starvation and cold during that first winter. It was the deadliest siege in human history, exceeding even the great sieges of antiquity in its human cost. After the war, the Soviet state crafted a narrative of heroic resistance. This narrative was not false. The resistance was indeed heroic, but it was incomplete. It omitted the cannibalism, the theft, the families torn apart by hunger, the impossible choices people faced. It emphasized the collective triumph and downplayed the individual suffering. The survivors themselves often remained silent about the worst aspects of their experience. Some things were too painful to discuss, and others were politically dangerous to acknowledge. Yet the Siege of Leningrad remains an almost incomprehensible testament to human endurance. The people of that city faced conditions that should have destroyed any organized society. They should have descended into complete chaos, into a war of all against all. Many did break, certainly, and the siege brought out the worst in some. But somehow the city held together. Factories kept running, producing munitions for the front. The civil administration continued to function, however imperfectly. People continued to help each other, to share what little they had, to maintain their humanity even when circumstances seemed designed to strip it away. In the decades since, Leningrad, now returned to its original name of St. Petersburg, has rebuilt. The scars of the siege are mostly gone from the physical landscape, though memorials stand throughout the city. The Piskaryovskoye Memorial Cemetery contains mass graves holding 500,000 victims of the siege. Russians still visit by the thousands, leaving flowers, standing in silence before the eternal flame. The memory of those 872 days has become central to Russian identity, a touchstone of suffering and survival, invoked in times of national crisis as proof of what the Russian people can endure. The siege raises uncomfortable questions that extend beyond the historical particulars. It asks what we would do in similar circumstances, how we would behave when the normal rules of society dissolve, and survival becomes the only calculation that matters. It demonstrates the terrible fragility of civilization, how quickly a modern city can be reduced to a struggle for calories and warmth, how thin the veneer of normalcy really is. And it shows, simultaneously, the remarkable resilience of the human spirit, the capacity to continue, to resist, to create beauty, and to hope even in the most hopeless circumstances. The Siege of Leningrad was not just a military event. It was a human catastrophe on an almost incomprehensible scale, a window into the darkest possibilities of war, and a testament to what people can survive when they must. Those 872 days changed everyone who lived through them, leaving scars that never fully healed. But they also revealed something essential about human nature, both its capacity for cruelty and its stubborn, inexplicable refusal to give in, even when giving in might seem the only rational choice. The people of Leningrad chose to endure, and in enduring, they wrote one of the most harrowing and yet somehow inspiring chapters in the story of the 20th century.